I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this special event, which is basically focused on reflecting, as you've seen, on Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste. And this event is sponsored by our South Asian Religions and Cultures Research Focus Group, an IHC Research Focus Group. And I don't know if my colleague Bhaskar Sarkar is here. Bhaskar, are you here? He will be coming probably at some point. Anyway, I wanted to thank him because he is the co-convener of our South Asian Research Focus Group, and he actually had the original inspiration for convening this event. So hopefully he'll join us a bit later today. And William, welcome. Another colleague. I see many of you. I'm so happy. Oh, here you are, Bhaskar. Did you hear me just thank you?
Thank you.
He had the great idea, and so I credit him with that. So anyway, I want to just say a few words about this book. Many of you may have encountered it, heard about it. There have been lots of special events. We had a racial justice series here at UCSB where this book and Isabel Wilkerson was featured. Originally was supposed to be an in-person event. It ended up being a virtual event, but an interview here with one of our colleagues in Black Studies, Ingrid Banks. So anyway, just a little bit about the book in case you haven't had a chance to look at it or hear about it in any detail. I'm not going to say a lot, but just a little bit of background. So in this book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, Isabel Wilkerson brings together the freighted categories of race and caste. And she argues that although the two are of course not synonymous, they can and do exist in the same culture, and they serve to reinforce one another. That's her main argument there. And she suggests that racism is the visible manifestation of a hidden and insidious caste system, a system of social domination that uses human differences in order to construct a ranking of human values. And these are her words. She says, race in the United States is the visible agent of the unseen force of caste. Caste is the bones, race the skin. Now, Wilkerson examines what she characterizes as the modern day caste protocols in the inner workings of American hierarchy, in which she makes what some have seen to be somewhat unsettling comparisons between America's 400-year-old plus racial hierarchies, India's 3,000-year-old caste system, and Nazi Germany's racializing project of Aryanism. So in his talk today, Vincent Wimbush, who's director of the Institute for Signifying Scriptures, I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, he'll interrogate the ways in which the categories of race, caste, hierarchy, and difference are framed in Wilkerson's book. And he'll reflect out of his own studies of the ways in which Black communities in the United States and the broader African diaspora have negotiated historically racializing regimes of signification. And Amit Ahuja, our colleague who's an associate professor of political science at UCSB, he'll then respond to Professor Wimbush's talk and will present his own reflections out of his own studies of the processes of exclusion and inclusion through which, well, I could say the processes of exclusion and inclusion at work in caste hierarchies and ethnic politics and marginalized subaltern communities in the Indian context. So we wanted to have this relationship of two speakers coming at this book from very different angles. And so we'll see, I'm sure this will hopefully bear fruit, and then we'll have a broader discussion after the two presentations so we can all engage these issues. I want to say a little bit more about our keynote speaker, Vincent Wimbush. He is an internationally recognized scholar of religion whose early research interests focused on biblical and early Christian traditions as ancient and modern literary, rhetorical, and ideological formations. And his work in this area has made seminal contributions to our understanding of the ideologies of ascetic traditions in Greco-Roman antiquity and early literature, Christian literature. And I actually use some essays coming out of one of his edited volumes on asceticism for one of the courses that I teach on South Asian discourses of the body. Really wonderful essay there by Patrick Olivelle on ascetic bodies in India. Now, since 1997, Professor Wimbush's research interests have focused on the social cultural history, practices, and politics of scripturalizing as an analytical wedge for research, or comparative research, we could say, on religions and cultures. And then that was from beginning in 1997. And from 1997 to 2002, while serving as a professor at Union Theological Seminary, he directed the highly successful multidisciplinary collaborative project on African Americans' engagements with the Bible. And this was an amazing conference. I had the great privilege of participating in, and Antace was there. 90 scholars from all different disciplines coming together to reflect on the history of African Americans' engagements with the biblical text from the beginnings of the slaves in the New World to the present. So it had to be a collaborative project. It was such a full range of possibilities in terms of explorations. Now, after moving to Claremont Graduate University in 2003, Professor Wimbush expanded upon this earlier project with the establishment of the Institute for Signifying Scriptures in 2004. And now this institute functions as an independent international scholarly organization. The purpose of the Institute is to facilitate research into the phenomenon of scripturalizing. And this, what is scripturalizing, and the way he's using it is, and I hope you will say this is an okay representation of this, the phenomenon of scripturalizing through which racialized minorities and other subaltern groups have historically negotiated meaning and power through engaging and appropriating, but at the same time subverting and transgressing the social cultural formations that are woven around normative regimes of scripturalization and signification. And Professor Wimbush has a large profile in terms of his groundbreaking publications, but I just want to mention three that are specifically related to this area and what we're talking about today. So his edited volume, African Americans in the Bible, Sacred Texts and Social Texture, that comes out of this amazing conference and has over 60 contributions in it. The Bible and African Americans, A Brief History. And then White Men's Magic, Scripturalization and Slavery. And these are just three out of his many, many publications that I want to mention. And it's a great delight for me personally to welcome my dear friend and colleague, Vincent Wimbush, here today. He and I have a long-standing and hoary, H-O-A-R-Y past, where we actually were fellow graduate students together. So I'm so happy to welcome you, Vincent, and look forward very much to hearing your comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Barbara, and warm greetings to all of you, whether you are in California parts or other parts around the world. Far too much time, Barbara, on that sort of stuff. Let's get going so we can have conversation here. But thanks to all of you for your generosity of time and for this invitation. All right, written by the highly and deservedly acclaimed author of Warmth of Other Suns, the epic story of America's Great Migration, the well-received book regarding the mass migration of millions of formerly enslaved and slave-descended Black folks from mostly the southern US to parts north and west in the United States. This most recently published and elegantly written and compelling book, Caste, by journalist, author Isabel Wilkerson, seems, as is the case with most major league trade or academic publications, to have been provoked or inspired by, it certainly reflects popular, compelling popular interests and needs, I should say. The issues behind the focus of the book I shall want to argue, as I think Wilkerson herself has indicated on more than one occasion, these are clearly named as part of the argumentative framework in the first book, but not explored in depth. They remained as a kind of haunting for the writer, and I share that. Wilkerson is unsubtle in betraying that her continuing interest, even obsession, is in getting a better handle on origins. The term is right there in the subtitle of the book, of course. Origins of the anti-Black racism that provoked this migration. It's almost too much the euphemism, but here we go. That provoked this infra-national mass migration of Black-skinned peoples. It's a kind of escape from ongoing humiliation and degradation. That was the focus of the first book. It is this interest, as opposed to caste per se, I want to say, or in general, either on the Indian subcontinent, Germany, or beyond, that explains the book that has our attention in this forum. Notwithstanding the giveaway term in the title, what is even more important, I think, is that Caste, the book, seems to me to be eerily and disturbingly at points too similar to the Western modern world mythic origins project that I know well, this that is part of Western humanistic, including religious theological studies. And here I think in particular my own intellectual formative subfield of biblical and related studies, with its fetishizing orientation to philological studies. To put it bluntly and pointedly, I identify the Origins Project as historical and continuing baseline orientation and practice of almost all Western humanistic areas of study. They're still determined by the mythic ideological interests as part of the dream experience about primitive origins, origins of the primitive. All the better in this case to have Asian, especially Indian subcontinental or Hindu, when it's not African traditions. All of you doubtless know the scholarship of the likes of Baba, Said, Vishwanathan around these sorts of issues. The type of project I'm referencing here has been ironically determined by the mimetic practices and politics of elites around the world, located within the formations that they made scriptural. With this term, I'm thinking of 𝘖𝘁𝘳 and the way he refers to almost all cultural practices in terms of the scriptural. These were subcultures become civilizations, empires, including, of course, the modern Western colonial. These all included religion, not merely or flatly as separate domains. Such a division never existed before Western modernity, if it can be argued ever to have existed. At any rate, all such pretty much registers the mimetic practice of exegesis, which carries with it the assumption or arrogation that what results from the manipulation of scriptures is the unique unveiling or revelation of true origins or the truth about all things worth knowing. Notwithstanding her superb journalistic training and orientation, we are in Wilkerson's Caste, I think, confronted with an iteration of the poetics that is a type of exegesis that channels and models to an extent, and in certain respects, the impulses and politics of these scribes handling ancient traditions, searching again for origins. These traditions, in this case, Hindu tradition as focus, are rendered classical, canonical, as they are made ever more opaque. And so it seems to me to be with Wilkerson, her Caste is a qualified example of the Origins Project, mimetically translated by modern world Protestantism in its dominance and its refractions, especially in terms of colonial classification, interests, and needs and politics. And of course, a type translated again by Wilkerson into popular and professional cultural domains. There is for me layers of irony and poignancy in identifying this linkage, but I'm not able to fully elaborate on this matter in this presentation. I hope you hear that I think it's certainly worth further excavation. With the view to setting up a related and more important argument for the moment, I conclude reflections on the title, which seems to me to reveal much. Consider Wilkerson's use of the word our. So you must think, as I do, what or who is included with this term? The scriptural elites that include now Wilkerson? Discontents, is she here channeling Shakespeare and or Steinbeck, or there several translators? What are the discontents really? What brings them on? What's the nature of such? Caste? Discontents in relationship to caste, really? I leave this and other such questions to dangle. They provoke me, challenge me to read Wilkerson again and again. At some places, I'm left with awe, and others, puzzlement, confusion, some disagreement, to be sure. This presentation I view as reflections, not as a sort of formal review of the book Caste. The latter is, in this forum, used rather as springboard for our continued thinking about roiling over issues and problems having to do with the making and over-determination of difference that we recognize as part of troubling phenomena and dynamics in the world that we share. The begging question, should the problematic around difference and hierarchy, sublimation and violence be thought about, analyzed, referred to the term caste? What about race and related terms, racialism, racialization, racism? This comes immediately to mind as the category being, in a sense, denied or refused here. But I stress again and in another way, the argument that I think caste as historical and ongoing phenomena, and I'm fully prepared to face this assertion as a point of debate, is not so much the motor for the book Caste. There's song and dance around such, to be sure, but this book does not actually claim and cannot claim with justification to be, of course, a comprehensive project on caste. The category is rather used to think with about the perduring problematics of race as a kind of bottom line, particularly the invention of race, racialism, racism, specifically the categorization, signification, and brutal treatment, especially, not exclusively, of the Black-fleshed, the African-derived person in the modern world. But Wilkerson, as I read her, thought it best to go beyond race, ironically, in order to get critical handles on it, the haunting, the position being congruent with some modern cultural critical theories about the construction of race, naively leading some in flights of fancy to conclude that since race is no thing, it need not be bothered with. Wilkerson's book seems to be set up to offer caste as an answer to some of these ongoing arguments, the ongoing problem that race, even when not named, or when we're not able to get that grip, firm grip or handle on it, what it nonetheless evokes. I do not find solace or satisfaction or closure in this sort of solution I would want to argue is proposed in the book. I can come nowhere close to addressing all arguments or problems that any of us might identify here, but following Wilkerson in seeing caste as phenomenon to think with, I note that she draws on metaphors. Barbara mentioned at the beginning one or two of these metaphors that can help efforts to see how she sees, that is Wilkerson, the major issues. Two major metaphors are played with, and they're worth our continuing to wrestle with. The skeletal structure and flesh, bone and flesh, as I would put it. Also the house metaphor composed of the different levels, including that bottom or the basement, defined by challenging conditions, to be sure. These metaphors are used in order to try to get at origins of relationship between caste, shall we say casteism, and racism. She seems to think of the one as basic social organizational infrastructure, perhaps framing the other, the one being a more visible subset of the other. Here you can, she's just thinking aloud about how best to cast the relationship, the one to be understood in light of the other. It is caste, she argues, to be the older, more basic phenomenon, with race as belated and more superficial skin, covering, squaring with the no thing thesis in regard to race. There's not enough, perhaps there can never be enough time for me to register the problem, including loads of ironies and paradoxes with the skeletal skin metaphor and leaving it there. My chief problem, among so many others with the book, with some sensitivity to be sure, sensitivity to and about how dismissive and over the top a few, this is notwithstanding, Pulitzer Prizes and having Oprah have your back, a few over the top self-styled radical critics, both within and beyond the academy. Notwithstanding such, its representation of some critical approaches and assumptions that race is no thing and should be abandoned, it simply does not respect enough what a critical historical approach to caste and or race should demand and reflect. Part of my own position. So there's no focus, for example, on the invention, construal development of forms of capitalism or the market, or markets with their embedded, not separate values, arrangements, practices, from mercantile capitalism, the agrarian type, and all the refractions developing and appertaining thereto. The book says little or nothing about the perpetration of persistent forms and levels of violence beyond the understandably grating microaggressions unbelievably deemed all about caste. It sort of breaks my heart to read Wilkerson straining to call such experiences, whether in airports, airplanes, restaurants, to frame them as examples being all about caste, as though you're illuminating something by not using what we all understand, what pertained in those instances. And it does not help us understand the impulses behind movement or changes, using whatever term, from one social sector or domain or historical period to the other. How do we explain or understand the modern world situation and the invention of race after millennia of supposedly race-free caste or other construals of difference and hierarchy? My proposal or suggestion, first of all, forget origins. This is a phantasm, invented project again, with political orientation to stasis, to the project of projecting forward dominant ways of arranging all bodies and resources. One could take refuge in as a way of explaining what was going on with this project, the old trope, translatio studii et imperii, the kind of politics of transfer of learning and dominance through play with the scriptural. There's no origins per se, certainly no mythic canonical origins, except for the sake of religious or nationalist or denominational politics of any of the complexities, origins that is, that mark human and social life relations. Focus should be instead on ongoing work or operations, that is, on the nature of politics of categorization, classification, the politics of making difference, ordering, and arranging bodies and resources, and how it has worked and for whom, how it has been challenged. So not only because I have no expertise in Hindu, South Asian traditions, but also because I'm a student of Afro-Atlantic history of translatio, and because I'm convinced focus on such traditions as focus on race can produce substantial critical analytical fruit. I suggest a reversal of Wilkerson's focus from caste back to race, and we should begin with what the modern world, where we wrestle, where our roilings are located, and what it has wrought. This is really also, as I'm trying to make the point, really Wilkerson's interest. And the other stuff is really torture. But it is a sign of her socialization into that politics, into the psychologics of scripturalization that she thought it was important to play the origins game, or gesture in terms of a kind of tipping of the hat. She admits she's without linguistic tools to do more than that, to engage, rather, she must, the translators of classical periods and texts and classicizing monographs and studies. There are anecdotal examples along the way, which she adds to it, but there's no doubting the power of the framing. The politics of scripturalization, or translatio studii et imperii, is intoxicating and intimidating to scripturalize elites and all that they mesmerize. I'm going to try, let's see, Barbara, did you, let's see, do we have?
You have plenty of time. You please go ahead and don't feel constrained by time.
The sharing of screen. It says you.
Oh, you need to share? Okay, let me.
Can we try that?
Yes. Let me make you a. You can now share the screen. Should be able to.
Okay, let's see. Now, is this being seen? I'm not sure about it.
Yeah, you can maximize it. It's there, but if you yeah, that's great.
Yeah. All right. I want to draw your attention. Not enough time to elaborate on this. This is a wonderful cartoon. There was a winning cartoon caption from the New Yorker. This is May 24th, 2021. It's an image you see. I'll just summarize quickly. Big books are personified, made alive with faces, eyes, legs walking about, arms gesticulating, menacingly circling two individuals. The caption, "The classics," can be so intimidating. I fear this was to some degree Wilkerson's situation, and to some degree explains the nature of her book. And I want to suggest most of us are there, located in that psychic space or place. What now needs focused attention? I argue again, we need to go back to race. I want to double down on that. It's not merely the outside covering, the skin, the superficial, the constructed no thing. It is, on the contrary, as construction, layered, drawing on Sartre and his various translators, a kind of complexion, right? A complexity, a convergence of multiple factors, vectors as part of a language game. This is a matter of epistemics, to be sure, of social psychologics, even pathologics, and so forth. And we must not turn from this construction, but engage it fully so that we might, as literary critic and art historian W.J.T. Mitchell urged, begin seeing through it. Seeing through race, seeing race as medium, as analytic device that will facilitate our seeing ourselves working and playing reality. Seeing how race is made up will force us to see everything else differently, certainly in more layered terms in the modern, late modern world that we share. Race, Mitchell rightly argues, and I ask you to take a look at this wonderful cover too, that aptly, registers the force of the argument of seeing through race. Race, he argues, is the product of racism, not the reverse. He constructed a table showing race as compass at the center of antithetical terms and relations, vectors, poles, beginning with the vertical pole, let's say beginning at 12 noon, places the term species, in which the radical other is reduced to bare life, viewed through classification of the various sciences that come out of the modern world, that define it, with genocide as, of course, the radical, always the radical possibility. On its opposite vertical end at 6 o'clock is sexuality, gender, in which the racial difference is viewed in terms of violence done against females of the other, the consequence of rape or sodomy in relationship to males, all as taboo and part of the war against the racial other. These vertical lines have to do with quasi-natural biopolitical categories. Along the horizontal axis, we confront culture and political economy, ethnic identity, and class or caste. So at 9 o'clock on the west side, we have the category culture, in which may be included religion, identity, of course, arts, and so forth. At 3 o'clock, class. In the middle of the compass, race. Race alone is argued by Mitchell to be able to mediate, explain these various poles, how they relate to one another. It provides the central point of intersection, uniquely mediatory as concept, as medium or expression or representation, constitutive of society, its arrangements and subjectivities. If we want to understand how our modern world works, how it's set up, each other, the self, we absolutely must see through race. There's little that's outside it. We could take time to argue that point. I'm moving on with it. At this point, as time limits me, it might be appropriate to win my way to concluding by referencing a few examples of the ways in which race serves as compass trumping, I hesitate to say, all other possible categories in terms of opening up for us the workings of the world we experience. It is this world that was made new through contact with, and I always like to stay with the category Hortense Spillers, as literary critic, challenged us to use this contact with Black flesh, right? It is now the case that the world simply cannot be understood without seeing all things through this contact. I mean, for everybody, this contact, this sort of contact and its ongoing reverberations. Neither the past nor present in the world we negotiate can be understood apart from it. As it is unpacked, it can reveal much about how much trouble we have fallen into and what is required for stopping the fall, even if I'm convinced there can now be no redemption. The following close-up example I offer as types of situations in this country that should be placed alongside Wilkerson's examples of casteism. And here I want to draw on, as I have for the last several years, Toni Morrison. One simply can't get enough of her. Of course, one would have to draw upon her playing in the dark, whiteness, and the literary imagination. As she argues that the New World was forged out of play, sometimes violent and deadly, of course, with anti-Black flesh or racism turned into racialism, or with her term, Africanism. The relationship to the invented latter became the determinant of white male subjectivity, and through such, all other arrangements of the world that we know. For a vivid example, she draws on historian Bernard Bailyn's, another Pulitzer winner, and we may want to line these up. I think there's much to analyze here. His book, Voyagers to the West, a passage in the peopling of America on the eve of the revolution from 1986. I just want to note in passing kind of creative cover, well, what one can do, a creative mind could do with this. The ships with the various flags from places European to the westernmost parts of the West to begin the world anew, and all that sort of rot, right? So Bailyn's book, in which he tells the story of William Dunbar, 18th century Scotsman, contemporary of Thomas Jefferson, the Scotsman turned planter, frontiersman who settled in Mississippi. He was there to make a new world, to make another self. I'm fascinated by Morrison's glossing of Bailyn, who in turn glosses Dunbar, his exegesis, his reading of Dunbar's journal and related material, to be sure. Let me quote Morrison, quoting a part of Bailyn. Ever eager for gentility, this well-educated product of the Scottish Enlightenment and of London's sophistication was yet strangely insensitive to the suffering of those who served him. In July 1776, he recorded not the independence of the American colonies from Britain, but the suppression of an alleged conspiracy for freedom by slaves on his own plantation. The young erudite, the Scottish scientist and man of letters, was no sadist. He was nice to his folk, right? No ruthless exploitation. It's nice. He was known as, a good guy, but he was known as one who had absolute control over the lives of others. He emerged, the quote continues, a distinctive new man, a borderland gentleman, a man of property in a raw, half-savage world. Morrison's gloss continues on Balin. I take this to be a succinct portrait of the process by which the American as new, white, and male was constituted. It's a formation with desirable consequences, all of which Dunbar felt within himself, quoting Balin, quoting Dunbar. For the first time, a force, quoting again, a result of his absolute control over the lives of others. A Niagara Falls waiting to drench Dunbar as soon as he is in position to assume control. Once he has moved into that position, he is resurrected as a new man, a different man. The site of his transformation is within rawness. He is backgrounded by savagery. Who else but Morrison could write like that? All of this amounts to Dunbar's and a world of others, of course. In other words, this ought to be one of the frontline entries for psychobiographies for the creation of this new world. It's, of course, experiment in racial self-making via brutalization, violence, degradation. Backgrounded by savagery, it's disturbing to be sure. It captures perfectly the phenomenon. Racialization from racism makes the world that Dunbar knew, that Wilkerson knows even today, and continues to make it go round. Again, making in her most compelling way the point that it is racialization that is the thing that now must be understood to recast the world. The American nation, she says, negotiated both its disdain and its envy in the same way Dunbar did, through self-reflexive contemplation of fabricated mythological Africanism. This Africanist other became the means of thinking about body, mind, chaos, kindness, and love, provided the occasion for exercises in the absence of restraint, the presence of restraint, contemplation of freedom and aggression, permitted opportunities for exploration of ethics and morality, for meeting the obligations of the social contract, for bearing the cross of religion out of ramifications of power. Here, racialization has again trumped all as vectors for white male subjectivity, orientation, worlding. Sadly, there are so many examples continue to make this point. We can go from Dunbar and Tom Jefferson and on to, an hour ago. As part of the past, as part of ongoing operations dynamics, the making of race for the sake of, I'd want to argue here, the destabilization or even scrambling of European or Europeanist world casting. I can now only list some of them for the sake of consideration for our discussion, but I want to make the point that I think this focus throws light on the scrambling of older world casteisms in the sense that white Europeans no longer had to fight among themselves, no longer had to engage in that sort of politics. The politics now going forward have to do with distance or likeness in regard Black flesh. Think, for example, of the silences that are part of the text of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. The anxieties, the dripping anxieties in Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. And closer to our time, even today, Black Lives Matter, reactions to such. Critical race theory, reaction to such even today. The Obama era, the creation of the Tea Party, the Tulsa race riot massacre, 100th anniversary this week, anti-immigrant sentiment, right? The Wall, anti-Asian violence in the era of COVID, anti-voting rights bills, and on and on. Consider all of the above, so many other examples. They force us to consider on what basis we order the world. Racialization would seem actually on this side of the European forced new world to represent the recasting, if you will, miscasting, or certainly compression of caste in regards white groups. That should make a difference in the way in which we make use of and play with the categories. Now it seems the one category, the one operation, the one language game, deadly as it is, determines and manages difference. It is this category, race, freighted shorthand for racialization, not unlike my own continued play with scripturalization representing not a thing out there, right, that can be touched, that can be placed in the hand or on a desk, but representing operations, dynamics, politics, psychologics, pathologics, for which scriptures is freighted shorthand. I think that's what we're talking about here. That's what we need to confront. Morris and Mitchell are wise and right in their challenges. We must all now see through race, understand ourselves and our refractions as excavation, not avoidance of it or of anything related to it. And we must, with Toni Morrison, learn to, as she says, avert the gaze from the racial object to the racial subject, from the described and imagined to the describers and imaginers, in order to recognize what she calls the disturbing darkness that defines us all. Thank you very much.
Barbara, should I?
Professor Holdridge, you're muted.
Yes, I muted, so you didn't hear the background noise. Yeah, so thank you, Vincent, for those amazing comments and, as always, illuminating remarks that helps us to really begin to see through race. And before we begin our general discussion, I want to invite 𝘖𝘶 𝘖𝘳𝘓, our colleague here at UCSB, Associate Professor of Political Science, to reflect out of Professor Wimbush's comments and also to reflect more specifically on Wilkerson's book from the perspective of his own studies of caste hierarchies. So we've had the perspective coming out of race, and now we'll look through the lens of caste, and we'll see what we can do when we bring them together in our general discussion after 𝘖𝘶 𝘖𝘳𝘓's comments. So, Professor 𝘖𝘳𝘓.
Great, thank you so much, Barbara. I just, let me just begin by thanking you for this opportunity. Of course, Vincent, for his absolutely fabulous presentation. I will say up front, I'm not going to be able to match his eloquence. Just some really interesting reflections that we got to hear. And I also want to thank everyone who has, taken out time to attend this really important conversation, I think, and a timely conversation. I'm going to come at this from both in terms of my disciplinary attachments, which is as a political scientist. I'll also draw on my own research on caste. But in the process, I hope to have a conversation with some of the points that Vincent has raised in his presentation. So let me just sort of begin by just sort of saying that, look, my reading of the book in some ways, was very much driven by how Wilkerson wants us to read the book. So I did not read it as a political scientist to begin with. And therefore the things that jumped out at me, from the outset, this idea that when it comes to exclusion, when it comes to discrimination, whether you are in the United States and considering the African American experience, or looking at caste-based exclusion of Dalits, the former untouchables in India, or the discrimination and violence and the extermination project against Jews in Nazi Germany, essentially, these are projects of social design. And states have played, their role in these projects has varied. These have had popularity within society. So society is very much implicated in executing these projects. And those are things that we need to remember. Of course, there are very serious social, economic, political, as well as psychic costs associated with these projects. And Wilkerson does a great job in outlining these for the reader. This is not a book written for academics. This is a book written for the larger public. She's talking at a very, very crucial moment in history. Some have even argued a turning point of sorts to the larger American public. So we've got to keep that audience in mind also when we think of her book. And now here I'm sort of going to come at it a little bit based on my own research. What struck me so much was, because there's such a strong personal narrative that runs through this book, that ultimately, you could try and project your identity in different ways. But when you come from a marked group, when you come from an historically excluded, marginalized group, reinventing yourself, projecting yourself based on how you want to be seen becomes very difficult. Because you could get on a plane and they will look at you and say, well, you don't really belong in the business class. You could be stopped by the police and be asked, are you carrying drugs in your bag, just because of your skin color, your race. You could be accused of impersonating yourself when you go and try and do an interview. So, you could be working for the New York Times. You have the Pulitzer Prize. None of that matters because you're trapped in your identity. Right? It doesn't matter how you see yourself. What ends up mattering is how others see you. That stigma of connected to your identity, socially constructed stigma, is not going to leave you. And that, that comes through very powerfully throughout the book. And that experience is not confined to, it's not confined to African Americans in the US. Those are exactly the kind of experiences Dalits will report in India. Those are the kind of experiences Jews would have reported out of Europe, in the last century. So, there is that universality to the story that she's telling. That being said, there is a reason why she deploys the framework of caste. She sees caste as the bone and race as the flesh on that bone. And the reason is that, there is a certain purchase that she derives from seeing the rigidity of the structure. And that's what she's trying to point to, because she's looking at race out of Jim Crow South, and sees that rigidity across different aspects of people's lives, as well as how society is structured to reinforce that exclusion, that stigmatization of a people based on their identity. But if you go down that road, then the problem is that the caste framework that she's using out of India, a framework which is far older than the experience of slavery. It goes back by about 2 millennia. It has survived over this period. So there is a lot to be said for using that framework. But at the same time, that particular framework has undergone a lot of change. It has seen a lot of turbulence, and it is not as rigid as it is made out to be. And that the moment you acknowledge that then begins to trouble the framework that she's trying to use. Let me just give you a very simple example. Caste hierarchy is based on the principle of purity and pollution of occupations. So based on the kind of occupation, hereditary occupations people are involved with, they are they are classified under caste. Now, this is a rigid system. It gets reproduced generation after generation because of endogamy. But if you look at caste-based occupations today, that relationship of caste groups with their particular occupations has broken down in India. And then that sort of begs the question, how should we think about the caste framework, and how rigid is this? Let me also touch upon something else which makes things a little bit complicated. And I'm going to do this across 3 different ideas. One, of course, as I said, caste is not as rigid, and I'll discuss a couple others. And then I want to maybe just in closing discuss a few things that we need to think about as we get into a conversation about caste and its use across different societies as a framework. So, if you think about the caste system, it is anthropologists who've studied it over a long period of time will tell you that this is a system which is very much local in its lived experience, in how domination is exercised, is experienced, in how people rebel or accept that dominance, in how people mobilize, how politically some of these things manifest themselves. Let me give you an example. You can speak to, and you can find somebody who belongs to a Dalit caste, for example, in the northern state of Uttar Pradesh, which is the largest state in India. Now, this person shares a language, culture, clothing, food habits with an upper caste person in their state. And when you think about somebody who is Dalit from the same caste, but in the southern state of Tamil Nadu, this individual is very different from the fellow Dalit in Uttar Pradesh, because that connection of language, that connection of culture disappears. The point I'm trying to make is that because caste is local, it does unite in terms of people who experience caste in a certain way, but it also divides. Building caste solidarities across regions, even within a region, is not easy. Caste, in that sense, even though it is present across India, it is not the master narrative of Indian politics in the way that race is the master narrative of American politics. And that's an important distinction. Religion is the master narrative of Indian politics. And more specifically, it is the Hindu-Muslim divide. And why do I say this? I say this for a reason. Because ultimately, caste makes an appearance. It is sanctioned, endorsed, ordained by scriptures, by Hindu scriptures. That's where caste derives its legitimacy from. Now, the politics of Hinduism, and especially Hindu nationalism, has intervened here. Since colonial times, Hindus have become very conscious of their numbers, because in politics, numbers matter. And this is something that even Wilkerson reminds us. So hold on to this point, because I'm going to come back to this again. But essentially, today, in today's India, 80%, Hindus are 80% of the population. Out of these 80%, about 20% are upper caste, whereas Dalits, or the former untouchables or the outcasts, form 20% of the Hindu population. Now, given that the Hindu nationalists are worried, as an ascendant power, are worried about their political support, the Hindu nationalist project has been a project of the upper caste. They are the ones who are the dominant caste. But they have, because of electoral politics, because of their competition with other faiths prior to the partition of India in 1947, they have increasingly become conscious of their numbers. And therefore, they have been involved in this project of holding their flock together. For the first time, the upper castes are actually trying to figure out ways of including those who have been excluded in the faith for thousands of years, for the sake of maintaining political power. As it turns out, the terms of this inclusion are no longer in the hands of upper castes. Dalits are more empowered, they are more mobilized, and they want to be engaged in setting these terms for inclusion. And this then creates a problem for how caste is going to play out, and how caste is going to not just play out in politics, but also in social policy, and how people understand and interpret caste. And so in that sense, the dynamic of how caste and how caste rigidities are playing out in politics is really important, because it's this politics that will drive how the state perceives different groups. And it's this politics that will determine who gets the seat on the table going forward. As I said, caste may be legitimized by faith, but its legitimacy has come to be challenged very severely because of compulsions of democratic and electoral politics. Let me sort of also then now turn to another point here, which is that when we think about caste as a rigid framework, as a structure which is sort of locked in place, then we are in some ways denying the agency to subordinate groups. And this is a particularly pertinent point in the light of what we saw last summer, with the BLM, the Black Lives Matter movement, and seeing how geographically widespread it was, how substantial it was in terms of the number of people who participated, who marched, and also how diverse it became as compared to, say, the civil rights movement. And the point I'm trying to make here is that the subordinate groups have had agency, very limited, very curtailed, but we need to acknowledge that agency. When we think about rigid frameworks, we stop acknowledging that agency. So these movements, protests, rebellions have always been there. Even in India, there within the Hindu faith, there have been progressive movements, reformist movements. In some places, they have gone some distance, made changes to social attitudes. In other places, that has not happened. But it is important to understand that the subordinate groups do have some degree of agency. I think it's important, it's essential that we see these criticisms and take these criticisms seriously, because I'm not the only one who's raising this. There are other people who've raised this, especially people who've read, scholars of caste who've read this work. Because if we don't do that, then in some ways what we're denying is the evolution of how caste and caste dynamics have changed in India. And if you're going to borrow that framework, then it's absolutely essential to see where that framework stands today. And it is most important to acknowledge the challenges as well as the achievements of those who have done the most to change this framework. And I'm thinking about the Dalits here, whose movements, whose electoral mobilization has had a deep impact on how caste is perceived socially and how caste-related issues are seen in India. But the other side of the story is that caste discrimination has evolved. It has changed. And if we don't see how the framework of caste has changed, we are not taking into account that evolution, those changes that are occurring, because that problem has not disappeared. It's still there, but it needs to be acknowledged in its current form rather than its ancient scriptural form, as I think Wilkerson tends to do. Okay, let me now tell you about three things. Here I want to sort of talk a little bit about a criticism that I spotted against the book, which I think, which I would say I don't entirely agree. A lot of people have said that Wilkerson has not acknowledged the relationship between capitalist forces and essentially race dominance, and that is there is a definite point to that. But to say that everything about capitalism is about racial oppression, we need to sort of take a step back and think about it. And I specifically want to point to the experience in India, where, sure, capitalist forces, market forces are implicated in exploitation of Dalits, but at the same time, they have opened opportunities for Dalits to participate in new occupations, occupations that have destigmatized their lives, that have allowed them to, explore avenues of upward mobility. So, our approach to the exploitative nature of capitalism needs to be a little bit more measured, so that we can think about it in ways which are more productive, in the sense, what can be harnessed and where are things where changes need to be made. Let me also now just touch upon something else where, where I think Wilkerson's book, makes some interesting things, gives us some interesting things to think about. I'm going to come back to the point of numbers. There is an anxiety around numbers. Demographics are perceived to be destiny. And as America becomes more multiracial, multi-ethnic, there is an anxiety about the place of the white community in society. But Isabel Wilkerson also reminds us that, look, the white identity in itself has been a constructed identity, right? And what is constructed can be reconstructed, can be deconstructed. And my point here is this, that there were certain incentives, there were certain forces that allowed this white identity to be constructed. Groups that were, different, that even discriminated against each other, came to be seen as white. They intermingled, they intermarried, and they were all, as she reminds us, united by their attitudes and their treatment of the excluded African American community. But as the numbers change, political incentives change, electoral incentives change, there may be opportunities to think about identities in a different way. There are, if there was agglomeration in the past, there can be fragmentation now. There can be the building of new identities under different banners that will give and create more opportunities for the kind of politics that has sustained discrimination, that has sustained racism over a long period, to be tempered, to be moderated, to be changed. And I sort of say this because, when Wilkerson thinks about the caste problem and its manifestation, she looks at the problem in a systemic way. But when she thinks about potential solutions, she looks at, she confines herself to change in individual attitudes. And clearly the change in individual attitudes or a social revolution are sort of at the extreme ends of the solution spectrum. Oftentimes when societies changes of this nature, social attitudes is incremental. It occurs at a glacial speed, and it has to be sustained through certain set of incentives. What I'm trying to say is that those incentives are changing. And that doesn't necessarily mean that racism will go away or it will be reduced. Because if anything, India also tells us that a group, which is, and I'm thinking about the upper caste, were 20% of the population, have managed to stay in a dominant position over a long period of time. So they have managed to work politics in ways that sustains their privileged position. So, declining numbers doesn't mean a decline in power. But as numbers decline, as political incentives, electoral incentives change, there are possibilities. There are possibilities for reconfiguring new identities, new kinds of political projects which address these long-standing fault lines in our society, but also which are able to fully confront the historical injustice of slavery and racism. I want to sort of end by just drawing on some of my own research, and in some ways reverse the kind of question that or the framework that Wilkerson deploys, which is looking at race as caste. And let me sort of draw, and the question I sort of want to ask is, should we actually be looking at caste more, drawing more on the experience of race? And I say this for a reason. And the reason being the colonial experience, where a country colonizes a certain region, and the people who are seen as rulers and masters are from a different race. And that experience has left a particular legacy. Let me point to two of those. In India, skin tone, skin color is not a marker of race. It varies within a particular community. It varies even within a family. And yet, the fascination and the desire for having fairer skin tone is as strong in India as it is in the African American community here. And what is really interesting is that when you think about people, it's in some ways, it's seen as the aspirational skin tone of India. This is a country which is for the most part dark skin toned. And yet across the land, people aspire to have a fair skin tone. It has the second largest consumption of fairness creams anywhere in the world, Japan being the first on that list. The point that I'm trying to make here is that where does this fascination, where does this desire for fair skin tone come from? And, you know, since Barbara is chairing this meeting, you know, I'm sure she will, she could probably say a little bit more on this, but if you go back to the Hindu gods, many of them in earlier times were, if you look at their images, if you look at how they are presented with a dark skin tone. So if we were worshipping our gods with, and you know, who had darker skin, then where does this new fascination for fair skin tone come from? And in fact, why have the idols, the images, the depiction of Hindu gods changed over a period of time? Because you can't find dark-skinned gods anymore. Most of the gods are actually being presented as fair-skinned. And, you know, people have argued that the colonial experience has a role to play. People have argued that the dominance of Western media has had a role to play. Who is successful? Who is popular? Who is powerful? Someone with a white skin tone. And therefore, you know, should we be surprised that people aspire to have a fair skin tone? Another aspect of race contributing to how societies see themselves and how a society with caste division sees itself in India is this idea which the colonial military, the British Indian Army, worked on a principle of martial races, where certain groups, certain caste groups were seen as, more fit for military duty. They had the stature, they had the ethos for basically, you know, fighting for the British in faraway lands. And the British discriminated in their recruitment patterns. They favored certain communities over others and classified certain communities as martial races. It's only when they needed more troops during the world wars did this turn to groups who were seen as lowly and non-martial or possessing of non-martial traits. And it was at that moment that Dalit castes, whether it's the certain Sikh castes in Punjab or the Mahars, who are Dalit castes out of Maharashtra, who got to participate. And they were very eager to participate in the military because it allowed them to associate themselves with these occupations, which were reserved for the higher castes. And they saw this as an opportunity to improve their caste status and how they were perceived by other members of the society. And, you know, if you go look at the experience of African American troops being mobilized during the Civil War, the experience is similar. A lot of them were willing to participate in the military, fight for the Unionist side, to be able to preserve their position as equal human beings. They were willing to pay for that right, for that treatment in their blood. And there is, and it's something very similar that we see when it comes to the experience of lower castes in India. But again, a framework of race was used in India to categorize communities as martial and non-martial. I will stop there, and I look forward to a conversation on some of these topics. Thank you.
So thank you, Amit, for really now inspiring us to think on the other side of this set of issues around race and caste. We've heard about the need to see through race, and now in a way you've opened up a range of ways to reflect on Wilkerson's book and these broader issues through the lens of caste. But I think now we can really open it up to a larger discussion about the complexities of really bringing together and juxtaposing, colliding, these two categories. Obviously, lots of questions have been raised about the appropriateness of Wilkerson's way of juxtaposing and these categories in the American context and the Indian context and the context of Nazi Germany. And I love the way in which, Amit, you brought back to, well, maybe we should look at caste now through the lens of race, when Vincent Wimbush had invited us to turn it back and go from caste back to race. So I want to open it up now and invite everyone to weigh in with your own points of discussion, questions. And I'm going to ask Maharishi Vyas, who is a doctoral student in the Department of Religious Studies, to help with monitoring the questions. And if people wouldn't mind using the hand function rather than raising the hand, because I think there are enough people that you go off the screen. If you use the hand function, it'll bring you back on the screen. And Maharishi will keep track of people who want to raise questions, and we'll move ahead in that way.
Right, perfect, thank you. Yes, thank you again to both the speakers. I see Colin has a hand up, and Colin, you have the floor.
Oh yeah, I'd just like to thank both speakers for tremendous talk, and this is definitely a really powerful area of comparative study. I think my dissertation is right on the line between caste and race, and so I think there are two different points that I wanted to make in response to what's being said here, to just kind of bring the discussion even further. One thing I wanted to mention about Wilkerson's approach to defining race through caste is that this is not the first time we've seen this happen. That in the 20th century, Gunnar Myrdal has a famous study in which he set out caste as this paradigm of race. And then a few brilliant Black sociologists, including 𝘊𝘢𝘀 Fraser and Oliver Cox, also responded to this, kind of arguing against the idea that caste was a great indicator of race. Common to all of these, to both Myrdal's source and 𝘊𝘀 Fraser and Cox's works, is that they all operate with a very antiquated and frankly incorrect idea of what caste is. They look at caste very scripturally, and one major error that they make is that they assume caste is constructed out of consent of all of the components of a caste society. So that they assume that subjugated castes are consenting overall to this framework, and that draws back in the issue that Amit raised with making sure that we honor agency in caste, and that we honor the agency of subaltern groups, that these groups resist caste hierarchies. And that's more true now than it's ever been, but it also has historically been true that to view the caste system as a system of consent is to deeply misunderstand what caste is, and to deeply misunderstand how caste oppression works. And so this kind of gets connected then to another idea that I have from Amit's idea about approaching caste through race. Another important dimension of contact between caste and race in South Asia, and between colonial theories of race and kind of South Asian society, is through the Aryan invasion theory, which did not necessarily map all South Asians as being from the same racial stock. And so in the instance of the research I'm doing, the South Indian state of Tamil Nadu was identified generally with a racial substratum of Indians called Dravidians, who lived in the Indian subcontinent according to this Aryan invasion theory before Aryans came in. And the colonial words used to describe these peoples were consistently describing them with dark skin, broad noses, but also with a truly savage, uncivilized society. So there's a famous quote about Dravidians having no words for love and compassion, but 20 words for murder. They are eager to devour the human flesh of those who visit them, like stuff like this, So in this sort of context, the colonial understanding of the racial populations of India wasn't consistently positioning all Indians as being part of the same racial group. They were rather saying that racial distinctions were very, very important to dynamics of civilization in India, because Aryans were the ones that the British thought brought all meaningful forms of civilization to India in the first place. And so there was a systematic denigration of this Dravidian racial stock. And so in modern Tamil Nadu, this has become the grounding of a system of resistance against Sanskritism and against Hindu nationalism. The final kind of point I wanted to make to draw all of this together is I wanted to refer to this article by Vijay Prashad that I think is really useful to kind of conceive of how we might be able to look at caste and race and compare them without falling into the trap of misrepresenting either caste or race. Wilkerson is taking this approach that's kind of reifying caste. Prashad's article looks at Africans in the global slave trade and South Asian, especially Dalit populations, as being connected through a common experience of oppression. And so he says, rather than trying to look at historical origins, or rather than trying to look at, as some have tried to look for, historical connections between Africans and Dalits in India, rather than trying to do that, we should look at the way that the systems of oppression are very similar, or that the experiences of oppression are similar, and resistance to those sorts of oppressions can take similar pathways. So Dalit nationalism in many ways is directly parallel to Black nationalism. There's a Dalit Panther Party that directly took influences from the Black Panthers, and that has resulted in offshoots across the Indian nation. So that, I think, I don't want to take up any more time, but those are just the thoughts that I wanted to quickly bring up.
Thank you.
Yeah, unless there's a response, I think there's a question or a comment from Kathy Albanese. Professor, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Okay, I'm unmuted. First, I want to thank you. I loved both of those presentations. I'm an American religious historian, and as a historian, the first point I want to make, and I'd love it, especially if Vincent would respond, and hello, Vincent, here I am. The book, whatever its manipulation of categories, is an action-oriented book. It wants to change things, and it's written as an action-oriented book. She's a journalist, right? And she wants to change. Well, as a historian, I want to point out how deeply embedded the category of race is in our history. And Vincent, I was absolutely delighted when you talked about Toni Morrison citing Bernard Bailyn, the famous revolutionary historian. I have done a lot of reading since the Black Lives Matter movement started. And one of the books I read was Nell Painter's A History of White People, that some of you, I think, are familiar with, who shows how whiteness gradually conglomerated as a category. And for somebody who has been an Emerson scholar all her life, I was absolutely floored when she has several chapters on Ralph Waldo Emerson, and she calls Emerson the philosopher king of white race theory, and talks about his book English Traits, which I had never looked at because it wasn't very literary. So I went and read English Traits, and my God, the man is an out-and-out white supremacist.
Oh my God.
Really. And then I can't help noticing as well how different groups, as they entered the immigrant stream and became part of the American experience, were racialized. The Irish, who came from the old Celtic race in terms of the triple race theory of Europe, where there were Nordics and Celtics and Mediterraneans. The Irish were not white for a while. The Italians were brown for a while. And a book I'm reading now is on the Mormons, and it's called Religion of a Different Color. and shows how Mormons, who a lot of whom were immigrants from the British Isles, from working class people, were racialized as not white. And there are all these drawings and cartoons that show that they just don't have white characteristics. They're an inferior race. So when you see this kind of rootedness in American culture, the project, the task of ending systemic racism, as it's put so often now, becomes, oh my God, how is this ever going to happen? It will take a century, if that. So, you know, that is not a recipe for optimism, but it is real. And I think that to name it for what it is, and it's race more than caste, is a first step in that direction. So, Vincent, I would love to have you comment on that, especially because, you know, you're the Americanist here.
Well, greetings to you, Kathy. Am I being heard? I want to make sure
Yes,
it's
you
coming through. Yeah, I certainly agree with all the points that you touch on there. We seem to be in agreement. I just want to make this simple point as strongly as I can. This is not a matter of tearing Wilkerson apart. I see what she aims to do. I think it is a mistake to try to walk away from it, that is race and its problematics, in order to come to terms with it, to get a stronger grip or whatever image we should apply to that. So I'm in agreement with some philosophers, other kinds of critics. Obviously, I'm in love with Toni Morrison around these issues and others. In-depth studies, transdisciplinary studies that will help us understand what has been done, that is how the very air that we breathe has turned around this agreement to make of Black flesh something like the limbing out of not just the US, but one could say the West and almost all of the rest of the world, the extent to which the West remains dominant. This has been done through an in a sense, as a point of sacrificing the Black flesh made by some of us into a body with agency. So it's sort of like it's pollution or a kind of virus. This is obviously in our vocabulary these days. The thing is to go at it, as it were, with the vengeance in the way that Black Lives Matter does, or the 1619 Project does. We have to engage it. We have to wrestle with it. So trying to explain it away is no good. Ignoring it, denying it, that's no good. The sleight of hand comparative work, that's not going to work. I will accede, I'm no expert in terms of the deep and broad histories of either the Indian subcontinent or any other complex of civilization in the world. But it seems to me we cannot be in denial that the violence that was the making the colonial world has changed everything. So it's not a matter of some easy going back to do tag work. It seems to me that that's exegetical tag work, and that will not work. Everything has changed. So your examples about white ethnics, that makes the whole point, that the caste system within European orders among so-called white people, people who became white, was compressed in relationship to what everybody agreed about the Black body, right? That's what we're talking about. So you can't walk away from that. Everybody has been affected by that. Black people are affected by that, right? That makes for actually the decompression on our end, which is doubly, triply troubling. That you can agree to the degradation of Black flesh turned body as the basis for limbing out that kind of world. The Dunbars of the world, Thomas Jefferson is sort of like one of the QAnon Tea Party types. He couldn't help confessing. You know, he just virtually says with all that anxiety, you know, what was going on, and deeply anxious and troubled by all of that. So I just want to say that it's a marvelous book to think with. And I know she appreciates that. It's not a matter of, you know, this fine point of disagreement and the like. I think the major metaphors don't work. They're not illuminating. And I think we should go back to the table. And at that table, we must not walk away from race as the thing, meaning shorthand for these politics, psychologies, and operations that define us, all of us, all the time, almost everywhere. The challenge is to pick some place where it does not work that way. That would be my argument. I know we're running out of time, so I'll stop here.
We have more time. I think we've scheduled to keep this going till 2 if people want to continue to
All right.
ask questions. Can I interject something? I mean, actually, Maharshi, you have a list, and I don't want to jump ahead. Do you have a list of people in?
No, I think I don't see any raised hands yet. I do have a comment, but please go ahead, Professor.
Yeah, so I want to step back and think about, I mean, it's really important what we're talking about, and seeing through race in the modern period, not only America, but throughout the world, and the importance of this. But I want to step back and ask about the use of the category of race, which we think of as a modern category, and racializing and so on. But in my own work, you know, I have actually, and I've had arguments with our dear colleague, Rudy Busto, who's not here, I don't believe, who teaches seminars on race and religion. He's thought a lot about these categories. And when I first started talking about this, what he talked to me about was what I think in terms of the Brahmanical Hindu tradition. And even going back to, let's go back to the scriptures for a moment, to Manusmriti, let's say, and the ways in which the category of, I'm going to put Indo-Aryan, it's Aryan, but Indo-Aryan, just to kind of separate it from the modern manifestation of Aryanism. But the way in which Manu constructs the category of the Aryas, the noble ones, over against the category of the Mlechas. And the Mlechas are like the babbling barbarians. I mean, if you Mlechas, this, and he talks about, it's the noble ones, the Aryas who live in Aryavarta. So it's about a geographic identity. Those who speak Vaidika, as opposed to the babbling of other languages. And it's an ethno-cultural identity. It's a geographic and linguistic identity that becomes very circumscribed over against this kind of uncategorized kind of mass of the other. And I would say, and I want to use the term racialized other there, even if we don't think, again, of using the category of race. But I think, I don't know how else to talk about it, because I really do think there's a racialization going on there. And I also want to think about the racialization within the, let's say, the Varnashrama Dharma system constructed by Manu, as what we think of as the classical expression of the caste system, where he constructs, or the text constructs, a hierarchy of internal others. So starting with the kind of twice-born males, the three higher varnas, the kind of classical varnas, which I translated social class, not caste, because jati for me is caste. But say these three higher twice-born varnas: Brahmins, the priest; Kshatriyas, the kings and warriors; Vaishyas, the merchants and agriculturalists. The male members of these twice-born varnas, they have the kind of privileged status at the top of this hierarchy. Then you have other categories. You have the male Shudras, who are not part of, they are once born, and they're excluded from certain practices of the twice-born varnas. Then you have women who have their own category, and they have their own dharma, and they are separated out also in their own way from the male twice-born varnas. Then you have members of what Manu talks about is mixed castes that are born out of different kinds of unions between members of varnas. And the ideal in Manu is, of course, endogamy. A member of one varna should only marry within that varna, but recognizing the realities of what's happening on the ground, Manu tries to make sense out of what happened. How do we get all these messy castes on the ground? We have this beautiful fourfold system. How did we get to the messiness of multiple castes? So it comes up with this idea of the mixing of the varnas led to low-born mixed castes. That's one kind, generated through permissible types of what they call anuloma unions that go with the hair. And that would be if a male member of a higher varna marries a woman of a lower varna. To a certain extent, you can't go down too low. That is permissible, not ideal, but permissible. That's anuloma. But then you have the debased mixed castes that are even lower than that, generated through unsanctioned pratiloma units, which are against the hair, between a woman of a higher varna and a male of a lower varna. And so we've got already what, five classifications here, and then we have the so-called outcasts, or the so-called untouchables, now known as the Dalits. But within this system, they are still seen as part of this larger social body, we could say, this Aryan social body constructed by Manu. They're beyond the pale of the Varna system, in that sense, outcast, but they are always defined in relationship to that broader hierarchy. So they're still considered kind of part of that. And then you go to the final outliers. These are the mlechas, to whom these regulations of dharma don't apply at all. I think that, obviously this is the classical caste system and class system, or caste system, let's just use that term, that Wilkerson's talking about. But I would like to think about what are the racializing dynamics within this system. Can we use that term? Can we go back and use it in a pre-modern sense? Because I think it's helpful. I think it does more than just thinking with caste, to look at those dynamics within the inner, of the internal others who've been categorized and hierarchized, and I think racialized in important ways. And then, of course, the social body, the Aryans, constructed in relationship to this kind of undefined mass of mlechas. I wanted to bring this out because it's something that, again, Rudy and I talk about, and he's come around to seeing the possibilities. But I'd like Vincent and Amit to hear your reflections about, can we go back and use this term, pre-modern?
So let me sort of try and get, so it has been tried, and if you go back to 𝘖𝘁𝘓𝘗, for example, right? He does use that kind of classification to sort of explain the position of the lower caste and the outcasts. And he sort of even uses the phrase ghulāmgīrī, which is slavery, right? And so Ambedkar departs a little bit from 𝘖𝘁𝘓𝘗, even though he is seen as coming in this essentially belonging to the same line of thinking. So I mean, whether it's fruitful or not, I don't want to sort of go into that, because I mean that's, those, I would leave that to scholars who sort of engage that sort of classification. But all I can sort of say is that social reformers have used that kind of classification in trying to build their case, for emancipation.
So Vincent, any thoughts?
Barbara, I can't get in the weeds of your subfield expertise, but here's what strikes me as arresting and full of some possibilities. Again, for me, not for any kind of redemption for the world, but for critical transdisciplinary work. It's not clear to me whether what you are seeing all occurs either before or on this side of colonial world violence, Western colonial world violence. That would be one other thing I'd want to hear about or be tutored around. And obviously, I mean the kind of influences that come from that system of violence. The other point I want to make is that it seems to me that there are possibilities for transdisciplinary work on terms that would get us away from being kind of flat and frozen to being thrown into defensiveness, field defensiveness, religious defensiveness. If we were to focus more on what I think, from my point of view, Mitchell and Morrison set up for us, obviously trading on others, it's be the focus on operations. Now, this is what you touched on briefly, and I just want to say that it seems to me that that's the way forward. Amit also touched on this. That is the strategies, the work, the operations for making, sustaining, maintaining difference. If we were at point of punishment, like before a firing squad, not able to use these terms anymore, race and caste, this would be a way forward. Once we're unshackled, it would be the way forward. That is even a kind of comparative grid on what are the operations that people use to create difference and sustain it. Now, would we say about any of the categories of groups of individuals on the Indian subcontinent or anywhere else in the world, I'd want to know, would we say about them that their experience represents social death in the way that analysts of slavery in the West talked about the black and fleshed? See, then we'd be able to get somewhere. It seems to me we're not just talking about classroom categories and leaving it there, but really what kind of work was done to create the difference. Now, I go into this assuming it's worldwide, that there are strategies that are more or less subtle, more or less efficient, right? A way of setting up the kind of analytical grid, but there's likely to be some operations in common. The way you degrade people, the way they are humiliated. That's what we're talking about. So if you can forget caste and race and what that means for the moment, what if we were a group that went after that kind of problematic? Now, people all over the world have been treated in ways that would make humiliation, degradation work, make it relevant and compelling, but how on a deeper analytical level of excavation to go after that seems to me still goes begging still, because I think we're trapped in disciplinary silos, subdisciplinary silos, West and East, and and all of that. So it's not captured by you know, the experience of Hindus or the breaking up of India, or just what happens in the Atlantic, but, you know, this impulse to break up, separate, humiliate, and make experience a kind of social death when it's not physical. You know, that was the physical, you know, the exploration, that was the easiest part. But how to keep someone degraded, right? And organize a whole society around that. That's what we're talking about. And that should be, it seems to me, the kind of critical project that should be our focus going forward across traditions, continents, religions, et cetera, et cetera.
Great.
So, Barbara, may I just come in very quickly on that? I just want to very strongly agree with Vincent here, because, you know, in some ways, it also goes back to what Colin was saying. Ultimately, look, you know, irrespective of what the academic quibbles are, it's this kind of shared experience, which is so obvious to people who have been on the receiving end of that denigration, that humiliation, that actually builds bridges, that builds conversations across these communities. Now, you know, let's just remember, these are groups which are not exactly, the most well-connected, the most empowered, traveling from one place to the other, running newspapers, running, news agencies and companies. No, we're talking about marginalized communities who manage to learn from each other because of that shared experience across continents. And therefore, that is why you have a Dalit Panthers party and a Dalit Panthers movement. That is why Dalits in India closely watch the BLM movement to sort of derive some sort of lessons from it. And because that it resonates precisely because of the things that Vincent was talking
about. Thank you. Maharshi, you wanted to
ask? Yeah, I have a question, but I might reserve it because Anne has her hand up. So I'll probably go after that if we still have time. Anne, would you like to ask your question?
Okay, I just want to add a little bit to the discussion we've just been having, and I'll make it quick. Basically, I wanted to repeat back what I'm hearing as a key thing that you're saying, Vincent, but it also kind of picks up on what Amit's saying as well. When you talk about things like focusing on the work done to create difference, and you're kind of pushing us away from the static categories like race and caste. It seems what I'm hearing you call for is more of an emphasis on the process. And you mentioned earlier, you used the phrase race as a shorthand for racialization, and scripturalization as a shorthand for scripture. I guess I'm kind of wondering if part of our problem, and this also would go to categories like religion, is that we keep getting stuck in these nouns like race, caste, religion, as opposed to the process-oriented words. And it's the process-oriented words that I hear you emphasizing. And Amit, when you were just talking about, the Dalit Panthers as well as the Black Panthers, that's a process of interaction. So I just wanted to highlight that shift, because every time we use race or religion or caste as shorthand for something, I think we run the risk of falling back into, sort of essentializing these terms as sort of static entities, when that's not what I hear you guys calling for.
I actually really like that point. I think you're right. I want to sort of, I think nouns have their place, but you're right. The kind of attention we end up investing in them, then we just defend them. But you're right. A lot of the action is in these processes, and that sort of capture the experience rather than just categories.
Yeah, my final comment was actually along similar lines that you raised, Professor Ahuja. It sort of gets along with the idea that there have been global conversations happening across different marginalized groups, and this is something that I see closer to where I'm studying, where I'm working with tribal indigenous communities, the Adivasi communities, which are, as they are called in India. And you see some of the movements that are happening, protests at Mauna Kea in Hawaii, and the North Dakota pipeline, the protests against that, they kind of inform a lot of the ways in which protests happen, even in, say, Mumbai, where there's a metro metro authorities are trying to build a metro over a land which is occupied by indigenous group of people. Now that raises the question, although we bring these movements into conversation, and we can say the same thing about caste and race, it's about bridging and sort of sharing this commonality of experiences. But I do think that a lot of work, a lot of historians have also understood, like, while retaining the thrust and the focus of the nature of protest, it is also important to sort of treat differently the histories of both. And I think both of you, Professor Wimbush and Ahuja, you kind of mentioned that caste as an evolutionary ongoing process is sort of distinct. And I can say the same thing about indigeneity, which is a really interesting concept, because like when it goes back to those projects of origins, like who are the indigenous people of India, and we get into those unwanted weeds where it's simply impossible to sort of historically mark out like this is the indigenous groups of India, right? And so instead of thinking about indigeneity in terms of histories and origins of history, or history of origins rather, indigeneity is sort of conceptualized in a very different way. It's sort of indigenous in the sense of nearness and proximity to localized land, to localized natural resources. And that's the way in which indigeneity is sort of re-understood in different contexts. So I'm just trying to bring that to attention as, as we're trying to compare race and caste. Caste has its own different history, and it perhaps not a very straightforward implication. We probably can't import it, and clearly Professor Wimbush's presentation has made us aware about imposing an Indian category on already so much work that has been done on race, and like theorization of race itself, like just bringing in a new set of metaphors is not going to completely change the game. I had all these different thoughts just to bring in similarities, and I see this book as sort of doing a similar work, as work that is already being done in, say, indigenous movements, like global indigenous movements, especially with United Nations sort of declaration of the rights of indigenous people. There have been like similar movements where indigeneity is sort of understood in strategic ways rather than in how we understand as simply as history of origins.
Any fun? Yeah, sorry.
No, just a sort of observation. I agree with you. I think you're right. I also just want to leave you with this thought, which is, when you're sort of thinking about Adivasis, or you're thinking about other indigenous communities, or you're thinking about, if you're sort of thinking about, the Black experience here, you're thinking about Dalits. The one sort of sort of shared characteristic of these communities is the sort of retrieval of history. Because history has very systematically just excluded them. I mean, where do they feature? What is their role? And that's not just as a group, not just as a history of the community, but even within that, individual histories. Because those are just, when you start comparing it to people who are the dominant groups, I mean, that difference is so sharp and so vivid, generation after generation after generation. And in my interviews, I asked, my Dalit sort of interview subjects to tell me about their, their family history. And they can only go back so far. Whereas when I have the same conversation, within my own family networks, I go among my friends, among other upper caste communities, people can trace back their stories, 7, 8 generations. And that is just so remarkable. And it's the same with when you sort of start thinking about the Black community in this country. Yeah, those histories have to be. So in some ways, the point I'm sort of trying to make here is that, this entire project in which we sort of think about, the groups of the history of these groups and, how to categorize them. And then we start actually looking for sort of the, the real facts on the ground. Some of that history is just not recorded. I mean, in some ways, that is one of the defining characteristics of being marginalized, being subordinate, is that you don't have a right to history.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that comment. Professor Holdridge, you're on mute.
As we reach the 2 o'clock hour, I'm not a very good keeper of time boundaries, as any of my students who might be still here know. But I do want to respect the boundaries so that others can go on to different things. But thank you so much. I mean, we have so much to continue to reflect on beyond the categories. And I really like that, moving from categories to processes to operations to workings out, world makings, and the ways in which these things on the ground continue to manifest and collude and collide. So I hope we can continue these conversations. And when we actually are freed from the sequestering of COVID, I'm hoping that we'll be able to bring Vincent Wimbush to UCSB so we can actually have some living conversations.
Yes.
Embodied conversations on the ground. Yes. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. And thank you, Vincent. Thank you so much.